Jessica Holloway had never imagined her life turning out this way. At 27, she was exhausted, trapped in a cycle of poverty, loneliness, and resentment. She lived in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in Detroit, barely making ends meet, with a string of part-time jobs that never seemed to last. Bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and the constant stress made her feel like she was drowning. But the biggest weight on her shoulders was her 5-year-old daughter, Ava. Jessica had given birth to Ava when she was just 22, a time when she still had hopes of building a better future. Ava's father, a man who had promised to stand by her, disappeared as soon as he heard about the pregnancy. With no family support and no financial stability, Jessica had been forced to raise Ava on her own. At first, she tried. She really did. She worked late shifts at diners, skipped meals so her daughter could eat, and convinced herself that things would get better. But as the years passed, the struggles only became harder, and her patience wore thinner. Ava was an energetic child, always asking questions, always running around the apartment with a smile that never faded. She loved drawing on the walls with crayons, watching cartoons, and playing with the stuffed bear Jessica had bought her when she was a baby. But for Jessica, every moment with her daughter was another reminder of everything she had lost. Her freedom, her dreams, her chance at a different life. She never said it out loud, but deep down, she resented Ava. There were days when Jessica felt like she was suffocating. She looked at other women her age, living carefree lives, going out with friends, traveling, and chasing their dreams. Meanwhile, she was stuck in a never-ending routine of feeding, cleaning, and trying to keep her child entertained. She knew it wasn't Ava's fault, but that didn't stop the bitterness from creeping in. One evening, after a particularly long shift at a convenience store, Jessica sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills. The rent was overdue. The electricity company had sent its final warning. Her refrigerator was nearly empty, and payday was still a week away. As she sat there, exhaustion washing over her, a thought crept into her mind. What if Ava wasn't here? Wouldn't life be easier? Jessica shook the thought away, horrified that it had even crossed her mind. She wasn't a bad mother. She loved Ava. She just needed a way out. That was when she considered adoption. If she could find a family willing to take Ava in, she could finally start over. Ava would have a better life, and Jessica would be free. It seemed like the perfect solution. The next day, Jessica started researching adoption agencies. She made phone calls, asking about the process, hoping it would be quick and simple. But the moment she mentioned that she was a single mother and that Ava's father was absent, she hit a dead end. Legally, she needed the father's consent, even though he had never been involved in Ava's life. Without it, she couldn't give Ava up for adoption. Jessica hung up the phone, frustration bubbling inside her. She had been so close to a solution, only for it to be ripped away. There was no other way out. No one would take Ava off her hands. No one would save her from this life. The walls of the apartment felt smaller than ever, closing in on her. That was when the thought returned, stronger than before. If she couldn't give Ava away, maybe there was another way to be free. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. Every day felt like an unbearable weight pressing down on her. She woke up to Ava's cheerful voice, her tiny footsteps echoing in the small apartment. And instead of feeling warmth, all Jessica felt was exhaustion. She had no patience left. Every question Ava asked, every mess she made, every moment she needed attention. It all felt like another chain around Jessica's neck, pulling her deeper into a life she never wanted. She began to withdraw, spending more time in silence, staring at the walls, avoiding eye contact with her daughter. Ava, in her innocence, didn't seem to notice. She still smiled, still reached for her mother's hand, still waited eagerly for bedtime stories that Jessica no longer had the energy to read. But inside Jessica's mind, something was changing. A dark thought had taken root, and no matter how much she tried to push it away, it kept returning, whispering to her that there was only one way out. At first, she tried to convince herself that she could simply leave Ava somewhere, a park, a bus station, a hospital, anywhere far away where no one would recognize her. But the risks were too high. If the police found Ava and traced her back, Jessica could be arrested. Abandoning her wasn't an option. Then she thought about poisoning. It would be quick, painless, easy. But doubts crept in. What if Ava didn't eat the food? What if she got sick but didn't die? What if the doctor suspected something? There were too many uncertainties, too many ways for it to go wrong. Jessica couldn't afford mistakes. And then, one night, the perfect solution came to her. She had seen an old industrial plant on the outskirts of the city, a place that had long been abandoned but still had some of its machinery intact. She had passed by it before, noticing the rusted metal structures, the shattered windows, and the towering incinerator that once burned waste. That was it. Fire destroyed everything. It left no evidence, no trace. If she could take Ava there, no one would ever find out what happened. Jessica spent the next few days carefully planning. She started searching online about how industrial incinerators worked, how hot they burned, how long it would take to turn something to ash. She checked the weather, looking for a night with low visibility where no one would see them walking toward the plant. She made mental notes of how she would explain Ava's disappearance. She would tell people that her father had taken her, that they had left for a fresh start somewhere far away. She practiced keeping her face neutral, speaking calmly, making sure her voice wouldn't waver when the questions came. She had convinced herself that this was the only way. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about survival. If Ava was gone, Jessica could start over. On the night she chose, Jessica prepared herself. She packed a small bag for Ava, stuffing it with a few of her favorite things, so she wouldn't suspect anything. She waited until the streets were quiet, until she was sure no neighbors were watching. Then she took Ava's hand, leading her out of the apartment. As they walked through the dark streets, Ava skipped beside her, humming a soft tune. Jessica felt her stomach tighten, but she ignored it. The plan was set. There was no turning back now. The night air was cold as Jessica and Ava walked through the quiet streets, the little girl's small hand wrapped in her mother's. She was excited, believing they were going on an adventure. Jessica had told her they were going to a special place, just the two of them, and Ava had smiled, thrilled by the idea of a nighttime outing. She skipped beside her mother, her stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms, her tiny voice humming, a tune as they moved toward the abandoned industrial plant. Jessica felt numb. Her body moved on autopilot, her thoughts blocked off from the reality of what she was about to do. She had spent the entire day preparing herself, convincing herself that this was necessary, that it was the only way forward. And now, as she approached the rusted gates of the plant, she forced herself to keep walking. The plant was silent, the air thick with the smell of old metal and decay. Jessica pushed open the heavy gate, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, broken glass crunched beneath their feet, and the only sounds were the distant dripping of water and the soft buzz of insects. The incinerator stood at the far end of the plant, a massive metal structure covered in rust, its large door slightly ajar, as if waiting. Jessica's heart pounded as she led Ava closer. The little girl looked around curiously, her wide eyes scanning the empty space. She didn't seem scared. If anything, she looked fascinated. Jessica forced a smile, her fingers tightening around her daughter's hand as she guided her toward the incinerator. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind over and over. Ava loved games. If she could make this feel like one, it would be easier. Jessica reached for the incinerator's heavy door and pulled it open, the creak echoing through the empty plant. She told Ava to step inside, to pretend it was a secret hiding spot. Ava hesitated. She glanced at her mother, her little brow furrowing in confusion. Jessica felt her breath hitch, her pulse racing. This was the moment. There was no turning back now. She gave her daughter an encouraging nod, her face calm, her hands steady. Slowly, Ava stepped forward. She climbed onto the edge of the incinerator, her small fingers gripping the metal frame as she tried to balance. Jessica didn't give herself time to think. With a quick motion, she pushed her daughter inside and slammed the door shut. For a second, there was silence. Then came the muffled sounds from inside, the tiny voice calling out. Jessica's hands shook as she reached for the ignition button. Her breath came in short gasps. One press, and it would be over. One press, and she would be free. Her finger hovered over the button. Then, before she could let herself hesitate, she pressed it. The incinerator roared to life, flames bursting from within, consuming everything inside. The heat radiated outward, and Jessica took a shaky step back. It was done. It was finally done. She turned away, her pulse hammering in her ears. She forced herself to walk, to step back out into the night as if nothing had happened. The cold air hit her face, but she didn't feel it. She had erased every trace. No one would ever know. For the next few days, Jessica carried on as if nothing had happened. She woke up at the usual time, made coffee, and scrolled through her phone like any other morning. The apartment was quieter now, emptier. She told herself that this was what she had wanted, that this was freedom. When her neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Callahan, asked where Ava was, Jessica smiled and gave the answer she had practiced. Ava's father had come back. He had taken her to live with him in another state, and though it had been a difficult decision, Jessica knew it was for the best. Mrs. Callahan nodded sympathetically, mentioning how sad it must be to say goodbye, but Jessica forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to let anything seem off. At first, no one questioned her. The people in her building hadn't been particularly close to her, and without family or friends constantly checking in, Ava's absence didn't raise immediate alarms. But Jessica hadn't accounted for the daycare. Ava had been attending a patia, small daycare a few blocks away, a place run by a woman named Miss Harper. When Ava didn't show up for a few days without any notice, Miss Harper tried calling Jessica. The calls went unanswered. Suspicious, she decided to report it to the authorities. A missing child case was opened, and it didn't take long before detectives started asking questions. They knocked on Jessica's door one afternoon, their expressions neutral but firm. Jessica repeated her story, keeping her voice steady. Ava's father had come to take her. No, She didn't know where exactly. No, she didn't have his number. No, she hadn't thought to report it, because it was his right to take his daughter. Tata. Detectives didn't seem convinced, but without immediate proof of wrongdoing, they had no reason to press further. They left, but Jessica knew the matter wasn't over. Over the next week, police started digging into Ava's father. What they found was exactly what Jessica had feared. He had no contact with Ava, no recent records of travel, and no involvement in her life. There were no flights booked in his name, no bus tickets, no proof that he had ever taken Ava anywhere. The story was beginning to crack. Security footage from the neighborhood provided the final clue. A grainy but clear recording from a street camera showed Jessica and Ava walking toward the abandoned industrial plant late at night, but there was no footage of them coming back. Detectives revisited the plant, searching the premises for any sign of the child. What they found was chilling. Inside the incinerator, buried beneath layers of ash, were small bone fragments. They were tested, and the results confirmed the worst. Ava's remains had been found. Jessica was arrested at her apartment, handcuffed as neighbors watched in shock. She didn't fight back. She didn't cry. She had convinced herself she had erased everything, but the truth had found its way to the surface. The lies were over. Jessica sat in the cold, gray interrogation room, her hands cuffed to the table. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of what she had done pressing against her chest. Across from her, Detective Miller stared in silence, waiting for her to speak. She didn't. She had spent so much time convincing herself that no one would ever find out, that she had covered her tracks perfectly. But now, sitting here, she realized how foolish that belief had been. The evidence was undeniable. The surveillance footage, the bone fragments, the inconsistencies in her story. There was no way out. Still, she refused to speak at first. She sat motionless, her face blank, as if shutting down would make everything disappear. But silence wouldn't save her now. Hours passed, and the pressure mounted. The detectives laid out everything they had, piece by piece, forcing her to confront the reality of her actions. Eventually, something inside her cracked. She exhaled sharply, lowering her head, and then, without emotion, she admitted to everything. She spoke about how she had struggled for years, how Ava had been a burden she couldn't escape. She explained how she had planned everything carefully, how she had led her daughter to the incinerator that night, how she had pressed the button without hesitation. She described it all with chilling detachment, as if she were recounting someone else's story. The courtroom was silent when the trial began. The media had turned the case into national news. People wanted answers, but none of Jessica's justifications made sense to them. The prosecution painted her as a cold, heartless murderer who had taken her own child's life just to free herself from responsibility. The defense attempted to argue that she had suffered from severe emotional distress, that her actions had been driven by desperation rather than cruelty. But no one, not the jury, not the judge, not the public, could see her as anything other than a monster. Witnesses testified. Neighbors, daycare workers, even an old co-worker who recalled Jessica once saying she wished she had never become a mother. Each piece of testimony chipped away at whatever chance she had of leniency. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime unforgivable. When the verdict was read, there was no surprise. Guilty. First-degree murder. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jessica showed no reaction as the words were spoken. She stared, ahead, unblinking, as if the moment wasn't real. The handcuffs tightened around her wrists as she was led away, her fate sealed. Outside the courtroom, reporters spoke about the case, horrified by the details. People online expressed their outrage, their disgust, their sorrow for Ava, an innocent child who had trusted her mother until the very end. In the end, Jessica had wanted freedom. Now she would spend the rest of her life in a prison cell, locked away, with nothing left but the weight of what she had done.